Okay, thanks for coming. Disclaimer, a couple of people have asked me if I am the conifer expert. I'm going to say that I'm loosely the expert. I know a little about a lot of different things. I have worked with conifers a lot in my horticulture career, worked in a lot of conifer gardens, and the thing that I like about them and my use of them, I'm not an exclusive conifer user. There are a lot of those people in the world, and that's cool and groovy, but I like them mixed in the garden as architectural elements, as evergreen elements for that season of interest, their shape, their texture, their colors, all that sort of stuff. So when I was scrambling around this morning, fine-tuning this, those are some of the ones that I've looked at. We have a whole lot more, and we'll go past a lot that I wanted to talk about, but I'm trying to hold to a tight hour today. So I'm gonna need you to help keep me on track so that I do that. But that's kind of the gist and the layout of what I wanna do. Disclaimer number 2, I talk fast and I walk fast. If I do either of those two things too quickly, please tell me, and I'll slow my roll down a little bit. But we're gonna walk right over here and take a gander at the very first one. All right, the first one I want to talk about, I have a soft space in my heart for deciduous conifers. Does everybody know what a deciduous conifer is? You didn't know there was going to be a test today. So there are conifers that lose their needles, and there's a handful of them that will grow here. And one of my favorites is bald cypress, Taxodium disticum. Right behind me, that big evergreen behind the blue light emergency stanchion is a cultivar called Peave minaret. That is a dwarf bald cypress. And whenever you hear the word dwarf conifer, take that with a grain of salt, because that's a pretty big tree to be a dwarf. But the straight species, Taxodium disticum bald cypress, I've seen those 120, 130 feet tall, so big you couldn't get 3 people around them. So in that perspective, that's a dwarf tree. This is one that's been around for a while. As a small tree, it's kind of gangly and ugly. When it gets to this age, it really starts to get its legs underneath it and look really, really nice. The growth is very close together. It has that nice kind of rounded top to it. And I like that because it's smaller in stature compared to the bigger one. In the vein of being a deciduous conifer, that'll start to turn a really nice rusty brown. And if you squint, you can see those interior needles are starting to do that. They're getting a little bit off color. I say this again with a grain of salt. Thought it was going to get cooler. It's pretty warm today and the rest of this week. But once we get those cooler nighttime temperatures, that'll start to turn a nice kind of consistent orangey brown, really, really pretty. Drops its needles at the end of the fall, and you get that nice texture, the architecture of a tree, which I really like about this one in particular. The bark is kind of, I wouldn't call it peeling, but it has a really nice texture to it. So those are some of the boxes for me when I pick plants for my garden that I really like. I like things that look good winter, spring, summer, fall. I'll beat that dead horse anytime I'm talking to somebody. I like things that provide those types of interest, and this one definitely checks that box, and a lot of different cultivars. Any question before we move on? How old is that one? Maybe 15, 20 years. I've been coming here for about 20, 25 years. And I think that was just planted when I started coming here. That's a wild guess, but based on that size, that's what I would say. And for a conifer, that's a pretty quick, bald cypress are pretty fast growing and very adaptable to urban situations. They can take wet, dry, they like more sun. They can tolerate a little bit of shade, not much, but that's a really good urban tree also because of that. Does it have knees? I haven't noticed if this particular one does, but most of them do eventually do that. There isn't a real good reason I've heard for bald cypress forming knees. The thing that makes the most sense to me, and I saw this in a bunch of them growing along a river in Arkansas, when they have the knees, which are protrusions that come up around the base of the plant, it collects all kinds of organic matter in the rise and fall of water. And I think that collection of the organic matter helps serve that tree and kind of helps it to fertilize itself. Also, they grow in a lot of low oxygen soils. So there's some thought that maybe that's part of it. But I think it's more collecting those nutrients and also to stabilize it in a situation where there's water constantly going up and down. Those knees kind of help those roots with a little extra support, and also collecting that organic matter helps kind of keep them anchored in. So I think that's what the knees are about. Anybody else? All righty, we're going to go up the weeping path. So another bald cypress to look at. I think that's the only one. I restrained myself. There's one I might mention when we walk by. This is a cultivar called Cascade Falls. It's obviously a weeper. This is one that wherever you stop staking it, that's where it starts to do that kind of nice arching pattern. Again, I like this for all the reasons I mentioned with the other one. It's a deciduous conifer. It'll get nice rusty brown needles fairly soon. You can kind of see that nice bark inside of there, kind of peely, flaky, which is really nice in the wintertime. I love this soft arching habit, and just has great winter architecture. That's my favorite thing about this plant. Fast growing, wherever you stop staking it, it'll just do its thing there. So this one, obviously we kept staked at a much higher rate, so it kind of mounted over itself for a little bit longer. There's another one called Falling Water, which is more highly branched and kind of falls and does its thing. But I really like this one. If you ever find yourself at Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas, they've got a big circle of these planted in the center of one of their gardens, and it's really pretty, especially in the fall with the nice rusty needles.
Nice and cool inside.
It is nice and cool inside. I had one of these in my garden in Charlotte, and my daughter used to like hide underneath it. It was like her spot to go to. But one of my favorite conifers because of all those habits. Any questions about that before we move on?
How old do you think that one is?
I would say probably the same. Really fast growing. So another deciduous conifer. This is Metasequoia glyptostroboides, Sherman's Nordlich. This is a dawn redwood, another of the deciduous conifers, and a little bit different in habit, a little bit different in cultural requirements. This one needs better moist, well-drained soil, likes full sun. It'll turn that same kind of rusty brown. It's got a little bit of a flatter needle on it, so usually much bigger. This is a true dwarf. The straight species will reach 100 feet tall or taller. I am new to living in Raleigh. I've been here 10 months now, but I used to visit quite a bit. But acclimating and driving around Raleigh, I see a lot of these all over the city, great big ones all over the place. It's a great conifer, similar with the bark, kind of peely, similar color, similar architecture. This one has more, Metasequoia has more of a pointy top, while cypress is more kind of rounded. But I really like this one because it's much smaller and diminutive, and a lot of impact when that thing first does its fall color run. Probably not going to find this one in garden centers. This you're going to find it. Somebody asked me where to find some of these specialty conifer growers. There's a lot of mail order nurseries that will carry a lot of these individual ones. And catch me after the tour. I can tell you some places that you can find some of these. Any questions? All right, we're gonna duck inside here.
You said full sun?
Full sun. Yep.
More moist?
It likes moist, well-drained soil. Sensitive to drought. So kind of in that theme of using conifers in gardens, any excuse for me to come in here, I'll take it. This is one of my favorite gardens on the property. We're in the Japanese garden now. Lath House is behind us. They use a lot of conifers in Japanese gardens. This is Chamaecyparis obtusa gracilis. Very commonly used in Japanese gardens. This one has a little bit of cloud pruning that the crew that takes care of this garden has done. We've got a great group of volunteers that keeps the gravel raked, the weeds at bay, and keeps the bamboo mostly in there. But cloud pruning is meant obviously to invoke the thought of clouds. So a lot of work to keep these little kind of poofs out and pruning interior branches. But this is a conifer that they have done breeding work with to get a lot of different cultivars. But I really like this one because of that use in gardens. It's pretty consistent. It's a really good one. A solid grower. I like the texture. I like the bark as it gets older. You can see it's kind of peely and a nice kind of cinnamon brown color. This is a good old standby conifer that's used in a lot of gardens, and one that's good for that kind of design element and what I talked about when we first got started. Any questions before we move on? Most of the Chamaecyparis are kind of slow growing. So this has probably been here since the garden was put in, and it probably came in as a pretty big one. There's a couple of other ones back here, also with that same kind of design element in thought. Conifers in general can be kind of slow, kind of pokey. What type of soil do they like? This is a good classic moist, well-drained soil. Most conifers like well-drained soil. They don't like to sit in clay. They don't like to sit in moisture. That's the kiss of death for a conifer. They're very susceptible to root diseases and other things like that. All right, we're going to go out through the lath house underneath the pines. So as Blake mentioned, the members plant giveaway on Saturday, the magic is going to happen right behind us. Is that correct? And we've been watering the grass in preparation, so it's nice and soft when you walk on it, but more importantly, it's nice and soft when we put all those 4,000 stakes in the ground where the plants are going to be. I'm glad that's right out of Tim's playbook. He thought about that. Behind me are some signature J.C. Raulston plants. This is Pinus tadia. This is the North Carolina State University dwarf form. This is a tree that and correct me if I'm wrong, Blake, it's something that JC kind of discovered and has propagated and sent to gardens around the country. Hard to find. We're working with some nursery folks to try to get it into the trade. Pines are hard to reproduce. They're also very finicky, which I've found in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think I attribute that to just climate change. To think that you'd have a hard time growing pines in the South, that's almost sacrilege. But the garden I was at previous to this, I killed lots of pine trees, or they just up and died for no reason. I think unfortunately it's the way of things are going right now. But this is a dwarf loblolly pine. This again, grain of salt. These are pretty big size. Chew more over that way. In the wild, this native pine can get to be over 100 feet tall. If you haven't been yet, I'm going to give away one of my favorite places to visit, Shank Forest, which is maybe 2-3 miles from here. There's a bunch of them planted there with some of the longleaf pines. But a really good pine. Again, I like the short stature of this. Anytime I see this somewhere in another garden, I instantly think of NC State. So it's nice to be here where they kind of came from. And I would be remiss if we didn't show these in the tour. Any questions about them? Yeah, propagating them is hard because they don't come true from the seed. And if you look at all 4 of these, they're all a little bit different. That one behind us is much tighter than these 2, I think. And there's also one along down in front of the geophyte border that is much more loose and kind of open. But the folks that are doing research on these, we've asked them to keep up with. They've each got their own number so that we can keep track of that. And whichever one produces the best, that's the one that we're going to try to promote. There's a garden in Texas that I've been to that has one of these that's super dwarf and super small. Right. The comment was about witches' brooms, and that's a common way to reproduce conifers. But you really, I know a lot of conifer growers, and that's an art to get trees to grow from those things, and trying to reach them in most cases. They're up pretty high. I've heard stories of nurserymen that travel with shotguns and will pull off the side of a road when they see those and try to shoot them out of the tree because there's a lot of genetic material there to work with.
feet, or is that?
Straight species grows 100 feet. This one, I mean, the jury's still out. This is probably as big as they're going to get.
How big would you estimate that to be?
20, 25 feet, maybe 30.
Maybe 30.
Yeah.
Well, I've been here, what, 40, 50 years maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
So they're old.
We're going to go right down here to the next one. So again, in the theme of conifers in the garden, in combination and in companionship with other plants, the next one fits that niche for me too. And also, I'm always looking at plants that do well from an urban standpoint. This is Juniperus chinensis, Maymont gold, Chinese juniper. And this is a tree that is really, really bomb-proof in the urban landscape. Juniperus chinensis. They can take a little bit of salt. You see these growing on the shore quite a bit. They can take really crappy soil. They can take a little bit more of a drought situation. Typically, they're more of an emerald green color. And this is one, and I may be completely off, but Maymont is a garden in Richmond, Virginia. So I'm going to take a wild stab and say that maybe it came from there. But don't quote me on that, and don't bet your mortgage on it. I like this because of that yellow color, and I like it because of its toughness. They produce these it's kind of long, wispy branches, and they'll develop kind of a Dr. Seuss look about them, kind of unique and swirly, and I really, really like that in the landscape with other things. But it's that bomb-proof nature that I really like to tell people about and like to point out. Any questions? The question was, how are they from an insect disease management standpoint? They're pretty tough. I don't know much in the realm of insects that affect them, and because of their kind of urban soil adaptability, again, most conifers don't like to be wet. Bald cypress is always the exception to the rule. And there's some other things that I'll talk about later on that can take a little bit more of a wet situation. But in general, they don't like to be wet. That's a good rule of thumb with most plants. The other one I want to point out, let's walk a little bit closer to it. That's a tree that's really been affected by the climate, I think.
Really?
Yeah, serviceberry was tried and true, winter, spring, summer, fall, and they've really fallen to foliar diseases. That's another talk. Conifer behind me, this is a monkey puzzle tree, Araucaria, and this is a crossed hybrid with Araucaria araucana and Araucaria angustifolia. And Tim has recently cleaned this up. It had a lot of dead interior branches, but not something you typically think of as being hardy here, more a zone 7, 8 conifer, but this has found a happy spot right here. And it actually had, it's got cones on it. And as long as I've been coming here, I've never noticed that before. And a garden friend of ours was here this summer, and we're talking about this and some other things. And he's like, look at all the cones on it. And I was like, what are you talking about? And it was covered with cones. I'd never noticed that before. So first time for me to ever see cones on one here. But this is one that's not for the faint of heart. They're typically expensive in most mail order catalogs or plant sales. And this is something you sink a lot of emotion and energy into, and overnight it'll just up and die because it's not happy, it got its feelings hurt, or it misses its brothers and sisters. Not for the faint of heart. Very, very susceptible to foliar diseases, highly susceptible to phytophthora root rot. It's got a really thick, kind of prehistoric dinosaur-looking foliage about it. I don't know of any insect that affects this, but it's very susceptible to root-borne diseases. Not for the faint of heart, but worth talking about because it's kind of unusual in this part of the world. Any questions?
How old is that one?
Probably 15, 20 years old.
I was gonna say, that's the biggest one I've seen in this area.
Yeah, they typically don't get that big.
Is there anything in particular you can attribute its longevity to?
I think it's kind of protected against the lath house, and it's got a lot of friends around it, so it keeps the temperature kind of consistent. and it's happy where it is. And knock on wood, it stays that way for a little while longer. All right, we're gonna go across the lawn that way. And kind of in that theme of pine trees for the garden, this is another favorite of mine. This is Pinus densiflora vibrant. This is a dwarf Japanese red pine. I can think of, off the top of my head, 10 straight species Japanese red pines just in the United States at individual gardens that are just absolute luminaries in gardens. They hold well to their common name of red pine. They have really vibrant reddish brown bark when they get a little bit older. The straight species is really pretty with those branches. They're often pruned so that you can see those nice reddish brown flaky bark. And I like this one because it's a dwarf, so it works well in smaller gardens. I don't know about y'all, but I don't have space for the straight species. It can get to be 20, 30 feet tall and as wide. So this kind of scratches that itch that it does well in smaller landscapes. This is a pine that has done well in the South, but also sensitive to changes in its soil, changes in its root zone, too much moisture. Those are kind of crucial things with pretty much any conifer. This is kind of an area of tough love in the garden, and this one has done very, very well. But I like it. I like the tight needle structure. You could be creative and do a little bit of pruning to see that bark, but one of my favorite pines for the South is this one here. Any questions? All right, we're gonna head this way. This is another conifer that is good in a mixed garden, in a mixed border. This is Thuya occidentalis smargard, and it's one of the upright growing Thuyas. And there's a lot of different cultivars of this out there. Emerald Sentinel is one. There's probably 100 different ones. Very easy to find. Not my favorite, but I like the use of it here in this particular garden because behind me is the rose garden, and you can see them kind of peppered around the border to add that evergreen nature that you need in a rose garden when all the roses lose their foliage. We also have a lot of herbaceous plants in here that are going to lose their foliage. So these form a really good backdrop and kind of anchor different parts of the garden, and I think that's important. If you want something narrow to grow right outside your front door, a little bit away from your house, something like this is what you're going to look for. So thinking about things that grow up, the pine that we just saw that's kind of small and squat, that's one of the beautiful things about conifers is they can scratch any design itch that you want. Ground cover, evergreen, deciduous, upright, low, flat, and spreading, but I really like the use of this, and this is a good vantage point to see that used around the entire perimeter of the rose garden. Wanted to point that out. Any questions about that one? The question was about the different leaders, and you can see that there's probably 3, and it's the topic of much debate in the horticulture maintenance world about should you do structural pruning to conifers? And the argument, I think, could go in either direction. If you think about this growing someplace where they get a lot of snow and you get snow load on this, it's going to pull this thing in 3 different places and pull it apart. I've worked in gardens where we wrapped trees like this with nylon deer fence just in case that happened, or worse for us, ice. This gets rained on and then it freezes. It's going to pull it apart all over the place. So I think when these are younger and you see that, it's good probably to get rid of them. If you did that now, you're going to have a big bare spot in there because it's a conifer and it's been growing around this for a long period of time. So that's something that I think is really important to do when the trees are smaller and younger, possibly in the nursery. Also, a lot of times, some growers will put 3 cuttings in a pot so that it fills in quicker, and that is going to cause problems down the road too. But part of it depends on what the conifer is, but in this situation, I would say it probably would have been best to do this years ago. Now I think it's too late, especially that back piece. It'll be a big dead spot in the back if we did that. But I think there's definitely, it's a topic that isn't talked about enough. I've got a good friend at University of Tennessee that talks about this very thing, and it's a valid point. Any other questions?
I would have guessed this was a DeGroot spire. How does this differ from DeGroot spire?
The DeGroot spire is one that I like a lot, and that's definitely more upright growing. This is a little bit softer when it gets down to kind of this stage, and it's more prone to the than DeGroot spire. DeGroot spire is much tighter, but that's a close. That's one that I do like a lot. We're going to go into the conifer collection. So wanted to end up kind of in one of our. We've got two very conifer heavy areas. This is a conifer garden that's part of the American Conifer Society's reference garden. So a lot of newer cultivars of things planted down here, and a lot of good take-home messages to take, and kind of driving home some things that I talked about earlier. You really have to take how big things are going to get with kind of a grain of salt. I'm very much in the camp of planting things to develop what you want the garden to look like, and I might put things too close together. And I've never not been to a conifer garden that didn't look like it was, everything was kind of just crammed in and things were too close together. They get together, they're happy to be with each other, they're getting taken care of well, and they grow really, really quickly, and everything kind of mounds together. So what I'm trying to say poorly is we're due for some editing in here to take some things out that are a little bit too aggressive. I have a hard time doing that because there's a lot of nice things in here, but that's something that we talk about on a regular basis whenever we come here is, okay, some of these folks are too close to their neighbors. We need to pop some things out. We need to make some hard decisions, and it'll give the garden a little bit more time before it does it again, and we have to go through the same thing. So that said, I got three more things I want to point out. This is Abies Pinasapo aria. This is the golden Spanish fir. There aren't a lot of firs that do well in the South. This is one of the few. Abies firma is one that does well, but this is one that will perform well in the South. I had straight species of this in my garden in Charlotte, and it did perfectly fine. That's not to say don't pay attention to the cultural things. They don't like to be in heavy clay. They don't like wet feet. Organic matter is important. Supplemental irrigation when you go into a drought is important, but I don't think this garden is on irrigation at all. And we had a hot, miserable summer, and things have held up pretty well, I would say. But if you're looking for, if you have to have a fir in your garden, this is one that does well. Again, straight species can get quite big. This is a smaller one, which I like. And I think if it were out away from its neighbors and earlier in the spring, that yellow tint to the needles is much more pronounced than this late in the year. But a really good one if you have to have a fir for the South. You're not going to find this one at local garden centers. This is like a mail order nursery. A lot of growers in the Pacific Northwest, and you'll find this on some of those websites. Any questions before we go to the last two?
Just repeat the name, please.
It's Abies Pinasapo aurea. It's a golden Spanish fir. And firs have kind of a soft texture to them as opposed to spruces. All right, we're going to go right back here. So this nice glaucous blue one behind me is Juniperus virginiana, Glauca compacta. Juniperus virginiana is our native juniper, often called red cedar. It's not a cedar, it's a juniper. But I like this because of that squat nature, and I love this blue color. That's a lot of interest, especially in a winter garden when things are kind of gloomy. Those silvery blue needles really catch the light in the wintertime and add a lot of winter interest. I like that kind of low, squat, wide nature of it. It's a little bit different than you typically think of our native Juniperus virginiana. But that color is really what has always drawn me to this particular tree. Really good, adaptable urban tree. I was talking to somebody about cedar apple rust. This is a host for that. So you'll get those really ugly, gross, they're hard to describe. They look like the molecule of COVID, like a little Sputnik with these little, the closest analogy is it's a rusty orange ball with disgusting pink tongue sticking all out of it. And it has spores on it. When the rain hits it, it spreads it around. It's a really bad pest on apples and anything in the Rosaceae family. That's a host for it, unfortunately. The best way to control that is just to cut them off. But I like that from an urban standpoint, that wide nature. It's a really, really good color in the multiple season of interest garden. The last one in that same color scheme is Cunninghamia lanceolata, variety Kanishi. And I think this is one called ABG Blue, Atlanta Botanic Garden Blue. It's the China fir, and it's not a fir, it's its own special entity. But again, from a landscape use, a garden use, I love the broad needles on this. I love that kind of glaucous blue color and texture to it. I don't know if these were grown from seed, but they often have multiple trunks like this and will shoot up little pups. They can be messy when they, excuse me, drop their needles. You can see that we spend a lot of time cleaning them out, but I love the texture of this. This needs room to run. This is gonna get 50, 60, 70 feet tall, probably 30 feet wide, but a really nice interest in the landscape and in the garden. One of my favorites of some of the Asian conifers that are out there. Any questions before we wrap up? That was easy. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about the nurseries while we're here?
Sure. A lot of really good conifer growers in North Carolina. There's a really good one in Weaverville. You know, if you just Google, the best way to look is look on the American Conifer Society's website. I think they have a list of nurseries, but a lot of good ones in the Western North Carolina. There's a bazillion mail order ones. There's one called Conifer Kingdom that has a lot of stuff. They're pricey, but they grow good plants. Buckholtz is another one. They're on the West Coast. Isley's is another one. A lot of garden centers will buy their conifers from Buckholtz and Isley's. And if there's something that you absolutely have to have and you're having trouble finding, go to your local garden center and see if they can find it for you. If I can find them, they can find them. I don't like to tell people to change their soil, because if you dig a hole and just put nice organic matter back in that hole with your plant, you've in essence created a big planter, and the roots aren't going to go anywhere. So the best way to plant at a good depth and mulch with organic matter 3 to 4 inches. That's the best approach to take, and try to find things that can tolerate those harsher soils. Because there's a lot of things that don't.